For the past 6 months, I've been trying to unpack the meaning of one word: migration. It's something that seems deceptively easy to explain. When I first thought about it, I immediately thought back to high school geography, where migration was defined as the movement of an individual from one place to another. Easy, right? But the more I've thought about it, and the more I've talked to people who know far more about the topic than I do, the more I've come to realize that defining this word is not as easy as I thought. What does migration mean to you? If you're anything like me, you'll probably start to think about what you've heard on TV.
Asylum seekers,
Free movement,
A rise in migration,
influx of refugees,
border controls,
illegal immigration.
Did you hear that? At any one moment in time, there exists a whole range of terms to describe human migration. Think about it. Refugee crisis, immigration, mass migration, globalization, immigration, illegal movement. These are all words we associate with migration, and they're all used by the media, and by ourselves, to talk about the events that we witness on TV and in our daily lives. The problem is, I think this muddles issues together that, while intrinsically connected, are also unique. So illegal immigration issues are mixed together with refugee issues. Border security is mixed together with the asylum procedure, and so on. The point I think I'm trying to make here is that this use of language creates a hot pot, where one issue is related to another, is related to another, is related to another. Now, mix in with that varying perspectives, politics, and experiences, and you have some murky water to wade through to understand these separate but related issues. Now, the thing in common with all these terms that are synonymous but not quite synonymous with migration is that muddled up in them are hidden complexities of intent, duration, and legality. So, why is someone moving? Did they have a choice? Why are they going to that place specifically? Are they legally allowed to stay there? And if so, how long for? I spent my summer travelling across Europe and a bit of the United States trying to unpack these questions. I wanted to explore what it means for humans to migrate in the 21st century, and why this movement has come to be such a controversial and often political topic. Like I said earlier, so many of the things we hear in the news, immigration, the refugee crisis, the border crisis, are mixed together to the point where it's really hard to understand each of these issues as a separate entity. So the goal of this podcast is to take each of these terms, one by one, and unpack them. I want to look at how we use these words to describe certain situations, and why we don't use them to describe others. And on this episode, we're going to delve into our first, and most loaded term, migration. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. Let's get historical for a second. The human species has been migrating for as long as it's been able to stand on two legs. Literally, historical migration began with the movement of Homo erectus out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago. Just 10,000 years ago, most humans were migratory hunter-gatherers. Now, early humans migrated for a whole lot of reasons, including climate change, changing landscapes, and finding better food supplies. I'm going to do something a bit silly here and skim over about 9,000 years of human history and jump over to the Industrial Revolution for the sake of a slightly weird anecdote. Bear with me here. The setting is England, sometime between 1760 and 1840. During this time, human innovation resulted in a grand transition from hand production methods to machines. And with this came the development of machine tools and the rise of the factory system. Before this moment in time, devices for covering long-distance travel were extremely limited, but with the Industrial Revolution came a radical transformation in the opportunities for human mobility. first with the automobile and then with the wide-bodied aircraft. This changing industry meant that travel was suddenly accessible to large numbers of people who, in the past, could never have contemplated travel. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution in England, we often talk about the movement of people from small rural areas to rapidly developing urban ones. As factory businesses created new jobs, a large number of workers migrated into the cities in search of work in the factories. These people mostly came from southern England, but they also came from other countries from all over Europe in search of a better life in a new country. But what I didn't know was that just as people were migrating into England, the English were migrating out. This was the Great Migration of Canada. Although the Industrial Revolution began a period of economic growth and higher standards of living, it also acted as a catalyst for rapid population growth. Between 1750 and 1850, just 100 years, it is estimated that the population of England more than doubled. At the same time as the population grew, jobs that were previously performed by low-income workers were taken over by machinery. So, even though the Industrial Revolution was making the continent wealthier overall, jobs also became more scarce. During this time, around 800,000 immigrants arrived on Canadian soil. Now, the reason for that slightly drawn-out anecdote is to begin to challenge our idea of what migration, and more specifically, a migrant, looks like. When we think of migration, I think most of us think of people like those who came to England from other countries and from poor areas, seeking to take advantage of better economic conditions and to start a new life. But what we don't think about are those like the English that moved out of England who were also seeking better economic opportunities. Now, these people moved for the same reasons. So why do we think about them differently? And when we talk about so-called cultural takeovers due to migration, what we don't often think about is the impact the Great Migration to Canada had on Canadian culture and identity. At the beginning of the Great Migration, Canadians of French descent outnumbered those of British descent. But by the end of this period, the English-Canadian population was double that of the French-Canadian. Okay, anecdote over. Migration has been used by many media organisations, including the BBC, as a neutral term to describe the phenomenon we have been witnessing in the past century. The use, they say, is intentional to prevent dehumanisation.
The language that we use is, we're perhaps not in the same place as Al Jazeera on this, though I think we are in the same sort of debate as they've been. I don't think there's anything wrong actually with using the word migrant and the word refugee. The vast majority of people that we're seeing coming through those borders, whether on land or by sea, are both migrants and refugees. The issue is more about the dehumanisation of people in the way we cover it, which isn't just a language issue.
According to Don Flynn from the Migrants' Rights Network, it is a proper description for anyone who has moved across the border. Alf Mehmet from Migration Watch believes that migrant is an appropriate word to use because it's easy to understand. According to her, everyone knows exactly what we mean by migrants. Now, here's where I'd like to push back. Today, migration feels like a really loaded word that can mean many different things, positive or negative, to different people. Language is inherently political, and the language used to describe migrants and refugees is almost constantly politicized. To use one name over another involves a choice, and that choice carries with it information about the speaker's opinions towards those they are describing. As a result, I think it's interesting to analyze the way we use words associated with migration. Here's an example. Imagine a well-off professional from America decided to move to London since there are better job opportunities there. What word do you associate with them? Immigrant, settler, or expat? Now think of the same scenario, but imagine this time it's not a professional from America, but instead a professional from Nigeria. What are they now? An immigrant, a settler, or an expat? If a migrant is someone who moves from one place to another, then both an individual seeking asylum and an individual travelling abroad are migrants. But why do we choose to differentiate between these two things? As Anderson wrote in their book Illegality Incorporated, while some travellers, whether executives, expats, or tourists, are celebrated for their powers to shrink distances and connect territories, others are fretted about for the same reasons. There's this really interesting table published by The Conversation using corpus of contemporary American English, and I'll link to it on our website, that outlines the words most commonly associated with the size of the most frequently used naming choices for migration. So under immigrant, it has illegal, legal, groups, undocumented, Mexican, Chinese, recent, European, Asian, and workers. Under expat, it has American, community, living, Iraqi, workers, communities, British, Americans, and English. The Wall Street Journal argues that our use of language around migrants depends on social class, country of origin, and economic status. But maybe you disagree with that statement. Maybe you're like Tomi Lahren, who doesn't see this as a part of a greater race issue.
I've never looked down on someone because of their skin color. To me, true diversity is diversity of thought, not diversity of color. I don't see color.
The goal here is to not discredit one viewpoint over another. This is not a political podcast. What I'm trying to get at is that there are complexities and opinions contained in words associated with migration that we can't ignore if we want to navigate the politics of the current world and reach tangible solutions. Now, even as I say that, I feel kind of weird. Tangible solutions to what? The refugee crisis? Immigration? Globalization? Which, if any of these things, are problems? The answer probably depends on who you talk to. So, confession time. When I started this research, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And I'll be the first to put my hand up and admit that I thought I knew way more about migration than I actually did. But then I realised I was unable to answer even basic questions. Like, what's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker? And I don't think I'm alone. Google online trends showed that searches for the word migrant peaked in September of 2015, right when the refugee crisis was first becoming widely publicised. Even more interesting, in the final moments before and after British citizens voted for the UK to leave the EU, what is the EU became the second top Googled question in the UK. So that's why I wanted to make this podcast. I spent my summer exploring various topics centred around migration. My research started in the US, from the UK to Hungary to Germany to finally France. Each episode, I'll dissect one word we associate with migration, in conjunction with a case study. The goal is that by the end of the series, you and I will have a slightly better understanding of the human migration phenomenon we are witnessing, and the complexities that make up our ever-increasingly mobile global community. Next time on Motion, refugees. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to reference articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing Motion's graphics.